Welcome back, everyone. Our next speakers are Jorge Orchilles and Tim Schulz. They're going to be talking about Purple Team maturity models. So it looks like a really interesting presentation. So without any further ado, I'll pass it to Jorge and Tim. Welcome.
Hello, Red Team Village and Mayhem 2021. My name is Jorge Orchilles.
And I'm Tim Schulz.
And we are so happy to be here for the second Mayhem. We presented on the first one about adversary emulation and purple teaming. And now we're coming to you with the Purple Team maturity model. See, over the last year, we've really been telling people about purple teaming and collaboration and the reasons you should do adversary emulation, how to do it. And we've gotten such great feedback. A lot of organizations are seeing the value of doing purple teaming and have started doing it in purple team exercises. But what we get a lot of is, okay, what do we do now? And the benefit of working at a company that sells to customers and clients, enterprise level, but also does some professional services is we get to see the entire spectrum and speak with all of these amazing people. Of course, give back to the community. So that's what we're here. We're going to share what we've seen in the last year and hopefully give you some actionable things that you can do today when you get back to work, or not today because today's Saturday, on Monday when you get back to work. So a little bit about myself. I'm Jorge Orchilles. I'm the Chief Technology Officer here at Scythe. If you haven't heard of us, we love coming to conferences, speaking, giving back to the community, doing workshops and things like that. We also have these lovable unicorns that you're going to see throughout the presentation as we have different actors that we're going to portray. I've also written the Purple Team Exercise Framework, which we're going to talk about here in a bit. The C2 Matrix, co-created that with Bryson Bohr, the CEO of Scythe and founder of Grim and ICS Village, and Adam Machinchi, who is running the open source projects over at Red Canary. So things like Atomic Red Team, right? Before that, I was 10 years at Citigroup running the offensive security team. I also teach for SANS and have a SANS Red Team course. Back in the day, I wrote a book on an operating system you should not be using because it's end of life. But still like to put it because at the end I wrote a book, was a lot of work, would never do it again, do not recommend. Anyway, over to Tim. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Tim Schulz. I am the adversary emulation lead here at Scythe. And prior to Scythe, I've worked at mostly what we call FFRDCs, or federally funded research and development centers. And so while not as many people have heard of like Sandia National Labs, of course, people have heard of MITRE Attack Team, the MITRE Attack Evaluations effort. So I was lucky enough to be able to work with the teams while I was at MITRE doing that. So I've got about probably a decade of experience in this space, about 6 years in adversary emulation and sort of red teaming. So yeah, super excited to share with you, as George mentioned, what we've been working on.
I was super excited to hire Tim, so we gave him the coolest title ever, Adversary Emulation Lead. I love it. Actually met Tim at the first Purple Team Summit, so shows you the importance of networking and talking to folks. I know we're still virtual, but definitely talk to us. We're very open, always happy to help and give feedback. So do ask questions as we go. The benefit of having two speakers is that we can see the questions and answer them, sometimes even live. So what are we talking about today? Well, this is totally Tim's slide because he's very methodical. He likes answering the why, the what, and the how. So the why is, why does Purple Team need a maturity model? That's going to be our first item. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Now I'm going to turn it over to Tim to talk about the what. What is the maturity model? And then, of course, we want an actual practical way of using it with examples, because this is Red Team Village and we know you love examples and actual use cases. So we will cover the how. So to get started, the why. Why does Purple Team need a maturity model? Well, I said earlier, right? We've kind of figured out that it makes sense to collaborate with other teams, right? And we learned this the hard way back when I was at Citigroup. We had our blue team, right? Our security operations center. There you see the blue unicorns again. I told you you're going to see these throughout the presentation. And they're in charge of defending, right? Then we had our red team, our offensive team. Our offensive team was in charge of, at first, finding vulnerabilities in technology, then doing things like social engineering. Then we got to a point where we were testing response processes. But we did all of this from a stealth perspective. The blue team didn't know we were doing this because we wanted to realistically test them, right? And all of that brings value. So don't think that what we're presenting here today means don't do vulnerability assessment and don't do red teaming. No, that's not what we're saying. Then many organizations also have brought in cyber threat intelligence. And cyber threat intelligence has evolved as well from providing just indicators of compromise to the blue team to also providing things for the red team, such as tactics, techniques, and procedures. We want to know what threat actors are out there, which ones are likely to attack us, and then get those behaviors so that we can emulate them in our red team exercises. So this is the InfoSec team of today. And you might have all of these internal, you might have some of these that you pay outside, right? Vendors, either a red team that comes in, you might have managed security services or managed detection and response, or even a vendor cyber threat intel team. And that's okay, right? This talk will apply for all three of these. So how did we get started? Well, we got started by saying, look, don't just do blue team, CTI, and red in silos. Let's collaborate, right? For the longest time, and probably the last year and a half, or even since that first Purple Team Summit where I gave the first talk on running a Purple Team exercise, we said that a Purple Team is a virtual team, right? Where the following teams are going to work together and they're going to collaborate, right? Those three unicorns I showed earlier, right? The cyber threat intelligence team does the research, learns about a adversary that's likely to attack you. They look up those TTPs, those behaviors, tactics, techniques, and procedures, and they provide them to the red and the blue team. The red team then looks through that, creates a plan, and emulates those adversary behaviors, while the blue team, who are the defenders, right? The Security Operations Center, Hunt Team, DFIR, or Managed Services, all work together. And we published this research into what is called the Purple Team Exercise Framework. It's free. You can download it right now, and it should get you started in your first Purple Team experience, because a lot of people hadn't really heard of Purple Teaming. This was a great place to start, right? Starts with cyber threat intel, then preparation, which is very important. When you bring everyone together in that one exercise, they're taking time off of their day. So you want to ensure that you are using their time to the best, right? Be the most efficient. So you execute the exercise and then you have lessons learned. So how did this first Purple Team exercise go? Well, it has a flow, as we can see here in the next slide, that first, the cyber threat intel team provides a threat actor with the capability, intent, and opportunity to attack. You're all already sitting together, so you have a tabletop discussion. This gets, breaks the ice. Say, okay, look at this TTP. If someone were to run DLL 32, right, for a DLL, it's a signed binary. It's one of those, what we call LOL BAS, living off the land binaries and scripts. And would we be able to detect this? So the CTI team provides that. The red team says, all right, this is a LOL BAS. This is a file that's on all our Windows systems. Then the blue team says, well, I think we might be able to detect it with our EDR, because our EDR logs that run DLL 32 and then sends the log to our central log aggregator, say Splunk in this case, and then we have an alert on Splunk that's going to show us. That's fantastic, right? Sometimes that's not going to be the case. Sometimes you're going to say, hey, what happens if we run this? And be like, I don't think we have any detections for that. but that's great. You want to document those expected defenses. Then the red team is going to share their screen. And because they did that preparation, they're going to be able to emulate that for you very quickly and very easily. They're going to explain how it works, right? Run DLL 32. Again, it's part of the Windows operating system, and it's used to load DLLs. So before the exercise, we created this DLL that when it executes, it's going to establish command and control with RC2 server over HTTPS. This is the IP address. This is the host name. This is the domain. This is the port, right? We provide all those IOCs and we show it. So CTI is learning how the red team operates and how the attacker operates. The blue team is learning and seeing and has all these IOCs and these indicators. And then once the execution is complete, the blue team looks for those indicators of behavior and sees if it matches the expectation, right? Did run DLL 32 get logged by the EDR? Yes or no? Yes, great. Did it get sent to Splunk? Yeah, I did. I can see it here when I run a query, but there was no alert. There should have been an alert. Why was there no alert? Well, let's look into it. Oh my gosh, look, this is the reason why there was no alert. Maybe there was drift, who knows, right? Or in the event that you had no local logging, for instance, then you do detection engineering, where you create these security controls for those gaps, and then you test it again. One of the things about Purple Team exercises is you want to use a platform that is consistent and reliable. So you can re-execute that same exact TTP over and over as you do detection engineering. Once you do have a security control, then you can train the people, your SOC folks, right? What to do when that happens, go through the process, etc. right? The next slide was actually an image created by Tim that I totally stole and love because it says everything I just went through in a much prettier way, right? You have an exercise coordinator. Exercise coordinator is very important for Purple Team exercises because they bring everyone together from the CTI team to a blue team to a red team. They put the proposal together. They ensure the exercise is running smoothly. Highly recommend. That's a dedicated position. Then you do the tabletop, like I said. Red team emulates. Blue team shows the detection of those behaviors. If there weren't any, you do detection engineering, and then you repeat them, right? Which is fantastic. The next slide, you're going to see if you document all these TTPs each week of your Purple Team engagement, or however often you do a Purple Team, right? We know some organizations that do it once a year, some organizations that do it quarterly, some that do it monthly. But the point is that you're documenting where you stand at the beginning of that exercise and then where you are at the end of the exercise, and you show the improvement. Now, this chart I know goes up and down, and the reason it goes down is because we were baselining. We were going back to original system that we had, and in that system, there was very little detections. So you can see the improvement, and that was very, very important. So we finished doing this Purple Team exercise. Everyone's satisfied. It's like, wow, I learned a lot from the blue team. I learned a lot from CTI. I learned a lot from the red team. High fives. All right, let's get back to work because, exercise is over. And then what happens, right? Maybe another ad hoc exercise is in 6 months or in a year. Or we could turn it over to Tim to tell us what we are seeing most enterprises and small and medium businesses actually heading towards.
Well, and to sort of lead off with what George mentioned, some of the challenges in this space are that we do come together for that event. We see all of the greatness that Purple Teaming has to offer as an exercise, and then everyone goes back to their silos. And so oftentimes Purple Teaming will expose some pretty big gaps, whether it's in detections or whether it's in, if you have a really mature set of defensive technologies and stuff like that, maybe the tests that you're running up against it are not mature enough to sort of actually stress it enough to see if there's any gaps. And that's partially because all of these teams are independent. And so they're developing capability independently. They have different levels of maturity. And so the challenge is, how do we measure that and put it together in the current landscape? And I think the answer is we can't really do that with all of these teams. Oftentimes, if you have a large enough organization or even a small organization, everyone is so consumed trying to do the things that are within their current job that it's tough to collaborate and communicate because it's optional. It's something that teams can decide whether or not they have the time to do. And I think that is sort of the core issue that purple teaming addresses, is bringing all of those people together. And so the information security teams of tomorrow are going to be this blended purple team, all of these backgrounds, red teaming, blue teaming, cyber threat intelligence, as a dedicated team. And so that's where, for instance, as George mentioned, with not just large enterprises that have, dedicated teams for all of these to, carve off a couple people and say, all right, you're going to be now in our new purple team. I think for small businesses, this is the way to move forward, because you need to understand not only what are we defending against, but how are we doing it? And so we're going to show you a couple of different ways. First, what the purple maturity model is, so you can measure and see how we're going to continue to build these teams. And then we're going to go through an example that's going to highlight how a current team would use this model. And hopefully you can see yourself in there or your team, and how you can progress using this new model. So that's where overall our sort of argument here on why there should be a purple maturity model is that there's fundamentally different mentality because of that communication, because of that collaboration, than there is with the current red and blue teams. And so that's not to say that red and blue teams can't be effective. You're still going to need people that have the background. You're going to need red and blue teams ideally to sort of do additional things outside of what the purple teaming that we're going to highlight is. And for blue team, that could be things like, for instance, setting firewall exceptions and anything that's going to involve information technology administration and things like that. For red teaming, if they're, depending on how sophisticated and advanced your organization is, you're going to need dedicated people that are just trying to break in the entire time and are doing additional research on top of the threat research we're going to talk about. But overall, this is sort of the starting. This is that core set of skills and expertise that we think that are going to be required for most information security teams moving forward. And so with that, we're going to dive into the what. So what is this maturity model that we keep teasing and talking about? And so with that, let's walk through the purple team story a little bit, as George has already talked to, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's basically been this set of 3 teams sort of coming to the InfoSec scene. So with blue teaming sort of being the first set of larger teams, and then having red teams to address that in some space. We knew that, we needed to test our defenses. So of course, we're going to set up a dedicated team. And then cyber threat intelligence has sort of come along and really evolved and grown over the past decade into its own series of capabilities and teams beyond indicators of compromise, as George mentioned. And so that's where they really have brought context to both the information that they were providing the blue team and the red team with the tactics, techniques, and procedures that the red team should be emulating. And so again, this is sort of all come together under the umbrella term that we like to call purple teaming. Now, in this world where you have a purple team, what are they doing? How do we measure that? The way we've broken this down is into 2 major categories, and that is threat understanding and detection understanding. And so for folks that have a red team background, you might easily see yourself within the threat understanding space. If you've got a blue team background, you might see yourself in the detection engineering space. And I'll get to sort of the area where I think cyber threat intelligence provides the most value in this model as well. But overall, the idea here is that this is going to be a team that needs to leverage both consistently and as equally as possible. And so we're going to dive into how do we measure the maturity of our capability in each of these spaces. And so we did do that by, we have a 3-level model. And so overall, though, with detection engineering, just to our understanding, to dive into what that is before we go into how do you measure it, is overall, you'll see a lot of questions here around that are very similar to what threat hunters, what blue teams are doing right now. Although you'll see a couple of things like have detection's been validated. And so detection understanding is all about trying to understand what is the situational awareness on your network, what are the assets that you have control over, and what are they doing. And so from the same standpoint of the threat understanding, overall, the question here is, what adversaries are targeting our industry? What are the tests that we should be building based on the capabilities, the technology and tooling that they're using in order to test our defenses? And again, what detections have been validated. There's intentionally some crossover there because that's really what's going to be needed between the two teams. Having a lopsided team as far as skill sets and expertise is not going to be something that's going to be necessarily a benefit to your overall purple team. And so we'll get into that. And so this is where we're building our model. This is that first level of maturity. Maturity level 1 is deployment. And so this is where most teams start. So your team may not be here right now, but this is probably where your team started. Deployment is about using someone else's tools. And so can you take someone else's tools, technologies, process, and deploy it within your environment for some effect? And so this is where this could be vendor tools that are a new tool you're trying out to see whether it does provide value. It can be something like an open source tool where you again are attempting to bring out some additional value or cover some gap. And then it could also be something like indicators of compromise, right? Can you deploy indicators of compromise in your environment to have some effects? Can they look for it? Those. And so that's sort of how we span deployment here. And I'm going to go over an example using 2 open source projects that is going to sort of showcase this maturity model, this 1, 2, and 3, in both the threat understanding and the detection understanding. So level 2 is integration. So this is building on top of deployment. This is after something has been deployed, you've used it a little bit, and you've decided this is something that we want. And in fact, we want to achieve greater effect by integrating this with something else that we already have. Maybe this is 2 tools that you've had that 2 teams have used that have sort of been on a collision course, and integrating them is going to provide additional, people hours, or it's going to require less expertise in order to get spun up on one interface instead of 2. And so that's where this integration really comes into effect. But of course, it is building on this initial deployment. And so that's, again, this is, can you integrate a new process? Can you integrate something like MITRE ATT&CK? I mentioned before that I was going to highlight where I thought cyber threat intelligence could really play a role. And this role at level 2 integration for both the threat understanding, detection understanding where you need the points of integration, and where, for instance, you have threat modeling is going to help you identify where are the areas that we have gaps that we need to address, where we need to combine 2 resources in order to achieve those greater results. And this is where, again, cyber threat intelligence can really play a key role in providing context around both threat and detection understanding to help with identifying key integration points or showcasing how those integration points can provide even more value than they are right now. And then our final level is level 3 is creation. So creation, this is the sort of, ultimate, it's the top level for each, because if you can create novel tests and techniques based on your integration, based on your deployment, again, we're building up here, that it allows you to adapt to new techniques, to new threat groups that are going to appear in this space. And that overall means that you're going to be a highly adaptive team, which is going to be really important in this industry and in this space for continuing to adapt to new adversaries, and that's something that is sort of why it's the pinnacle here, is that in addition to deploying and integrating what you're doing, you have a team that can extend these tools, extend these technologies or processes to be tailored to your environment, to whoever you are going up against. And that is really, really important, especially, again, as we continue to adapt, because adversaries are unfortunately have been well funded. So they are adapting as well. So with that, I'm going to dive into 2 open source projects that a lot of you are probably familiar with, especially from the red team side. You've probably a few times been caught by some Sigma rules, and you may have started your journey or may use something like Atomic Red Team to help transition some of the testing you're doing so that the blue teams and the folks that you're running tests on can run similar things in the future. So the first one we're going to dive into is the detection understanding in Sigma. And so the deployment phase here is not just deploying Sigma rules, but it's setting up that scene, setting up that EDR, deploying it with what it's got and seeing, can you get those results? And so then you can work on building out and integrating something like Sigma either into just the standard EDR and your general logging and scanning, or it could do something like if you have a sandbox environment, making sure that you're running these rules against it to see what you're introducing into your environment. And so again, it's sort of making sure that you're providing additional value at each stage, that this tool, this technology, this process is providing additional value. And that's where we get to the pinnacle here, is developing your own tools, giving back to the community by releasing potentially new ways of building detections around specific techniques or procedures. And then, of course, developing your own internal Sigma rules, if that's something that you have a very specific use case that you want to be able to detect on. This is where your team is going to continue to work and build and play. And so that's why, again, creation is sort of what we're driving towards here. And that is because you are able to adapt anything that you're bringing in to your team. So, and of course, then we'll move over to Atomic Red Team. So most organizations start out here, and this is, we've had a lot of conversations with people that are just building out their initial tests. And so Atomic Red Team is builds off of, if you're not familiar with the project, atomic testing in software engineering, where you are building a very small focused test case that's only going to test one thing. And so that's where you can either use Atomic Red Team to test like a singular technique and it'll run through a bunch of procedures, or you can test a single procedure. And so that's sort of the starting point. Can you deploy Atomic Red Team to test your detections? Integrating that might be ensuring that anytime you are building new detections that you are running Atomic Red Team to test whether it works, or you're using Atomic Red Team in your detection development pipeline to make sure all of your detections work as they probably should. This is where I'll give a shout out to our friends at Splunk, who have released Attack Range to help with this exact challenge. Because as George mentioned earlier, maybe you have detections that you have built over time and you think should be firing an alert, for instance, in his example. And then when you are building new detections, maybe you change some of the logic to fit some new one that you're developing, and it changes previous tests. Wouldn't it be great if you had an automated way to see just how big of an impact those types of changes have? And that's where integrating these tools together can really have a greater effect, because you'll be able to identify and see that immediately, and not when a red team comes in and exposes that 6 months later, and hopefully you haven't had any adversaries that have been able to skirt by without being seen. And so this is that really important part, again, building value, continuing to build on top of your previous work. And of course, our top one here is creating and developing brand new Atomic Red Team techniques. So a lot of adversaries, depending on who they're targeting, what their normal mode of operations are, they're going to use slightly different variations of things, whether it's different flags, whether they like to obfuscate things a certain way, especially when we look at like invoke obfuscation and some of that. Those were based off of initial, I think the initial talked about when it was released, that this was a lot of financial sector threat actors that were using these techniques. And so that's going to potentially be, you're going to develop these new atomic red team techniques that are very specific to your industry. They're specific to your use case and the groups that are targeting you. And so again, that's why this is so critical, is these continue to build off of each other, and you will mature your level of threat understanding and detection understanding as you go through each of these. And so it's meant to measure a team, not just a tool. But overall, I do want to highlight communication as sort of, I mentioned before, and George mentioned before, that communication is sort of optional between teams. It can happen, the red team, the blue team, CTI can get together, everyone can talk for a purple team exercise. But overall, when it comes to a purple maturity model, this is a team. Communication is key. They are one team. They are all going to do this together. So communication isn't optional anymore. This is something that is ingrained. This is built, and it's felt that it needed to be explicitly said and covered in a slide because it is so critical to the success of this team. So with that, we have this 3 levels of maturity for both threat understanding and detection understanding. And from here, we can sort of chart them against each other and build them into this nice square to represent the 3 levels of maturity for both threat understanding and detection understanding. Because as we mentioned before, part of this is not just introducing, here are these maturity levels, where are you? But how do you chart the maturity of a dedicated purple team as you're building it and measure where they are in your organization? And so this is sort of the key slide of our maturity model here, because your team, every team is going to start a little different. And so if you have a super high level of detection understanding, you may start in the top left. And so this is where you're going to be needing to build out additional threat understanding, because there's a chance a lot of your detection engineers are building their detections in a vacuum. They're not being validated by a red team. There was a great talk at the SANS Purple Team conference that a quote I'm gonna pull from one of them. I don't remember exactly who it is, but the question was, that they asked was, how many red teams are looking at, detections, and in an organization, how many of those meetings are happening? And so that we're trying to drive that here with this purple team model, and that's where making sure you're going to build your threat understanding. So, you might be looking at this, you can sort of picture yourself, picture your team, and maybe others are not able to as much. So that's why we are going to walk through our last set of slides here, and is building out how we are going to walk through a fictitious team going through the purple maturity model. And so again, this is our sort of final question that we're answering in our roadmap, is how can we use it? And we are going to start by introducing Unicorn Inc. So as George mentioned before, unicorns are the Scythe logo and symbol, as he has a great shirt there. Also, you'll notice we've got red and blue. We definitely didn't coordinate this morning when we were working on building this presentation. But we're going to walk through each of the roles of our current team members. And the sort of scenario here is that they've been thrown together. They've been designated as the new purple team. And so we're going to walk through what they do before they join this purple team, how they're going to integrate the purple maturity model, and then what their roles look like and how things have shifted afterward. So first, we're going to meet Alex. Alex is our blue team background. Alex typically builds new detections based on the latest indicators of compromise from Casey, who's our cyber threat intelligence focused person. And so there's already some collaboration happening, which is great. And that was part of the reason they were chosen for the purple team, is that everyone knew communication was key. And so Alex and Casey were a great set of people to have already on the purple team. We have Brooke. Brooke is our red team background. And so Brooke keeps up with the latest and greatest red team tooling, AMSI bypasses that Microsoft has recently patched, and all of the things that the red team community shares on Twitter, and has tried to sort of integrate a couple of tools together for greater effect, and has had some really good success on some of their internal red teams. And then our final unicorn here is Casey. Now, Casey has a background in cyber threat intelligence, reads every CTI vendor's threat report, sends over the indicators of compromise to Alex, as we mentioned earlier, and so has a good working relationship with the blue team, and feels like they're doing a pretty good job. And so something you'll notice with all of our unicorns here is that they're all doing their job, and so that's not a bad thing. But again, this mentions and sort of ties back to what we talked about before, how this is something that I think a lot of companies can probably, and people can see themselves in each of these unicorns, and they are doing their job. But the problem is they're siloed. And so they're sort of, we have a little bit of breaking down of those silos between Casey and Alex, but we can sort of highlight what some strengths of collaborating can be here in the future. And so, as I mentioned, Brooke, Casey, and Alex have all been designated for the company's new purple team. So they're looking at this model, and then they're like, cool, we're purple now. Where are we? And so I mentioned before, just building off of the bios that we've built up here, that while Alex and Casey have done some collaboration, they've mostly stuck to indicators of compromise and deploying those within the environment. And so that means that their detection understanding is probably a 1. And then in this case, Brooke has done some integrations with their testing and, combined a couple of tools together for greater effect. And so Brooke has probably moved the threat understanding to the integration phase and beyond just deploying those tools. And so they'd probably start in the middle bottom. And so overall, what we want to chart out here is, how do we get them to the top right? How do we get them to a strong purple team? And so since they do have a little bit of this, lopsided skill set, the question would be, where do they need to go next? And so my argument here with the purple maturity model is that you are better off moving, if you have some sort of expertise and you can choose where you go next, would be to try and even it out and balance it out. And so move towards detection understanding. And so that would mean that this purple team would need to build their understanding in detections and the process and all the things, and would need to chart a path on how to increase that. So how do they get to integration? And so with that, we're going to dive into how this new team has sort of built out their roles to address some of those gaps that they've had. And so Alex is running new detections by Brooke to ensure that they work and are not easily bypassed. So this is something that Alex was already doing before, was building those indicators of compromise, was building detections based on them. The new part is frankly some integration between this new member of their team. So passing over detections to see, do these work? Are they easily bypassed? Incorporating new detection for malware that's specifically identified by Casey, our cyber threat intelligence analyst, and sort of bringing those in to make sure that we can detect against malware that's targeting our industry. And then, as I mentioned before, moving from deployment to integration requires doing some research. Where do we have these integration points, and where can we do additional analysis to incorporate, to increase our level of detection logic? And so this is where, each component is not just necessarily a doer, but also trying to understand, how do we mature this and build this up next? And Alex is going to be one of the key people in this, because Alex came from the blue team. So now Brooke is our red team background. Brooke is now going to start building tests to validate those detections. So again, this is part of that shift towards purple, because instead of just building new tests, it's making sure that all of the detections are working as intended. And so again, incorporating these techniques and procedures that from threats that have been identified by Casey, who again is our cyber threat intel background. And so this is going to make sure that all of the new malware and tools that the threats that are targeting the unicorn industry are going to potentially be already tested against, and we'll see if there's detections. But that doesn't mean that Brooke is going to stay off Twitter, and that's okay, because new techniques from Twitter can be passed on to Alex to either build detections for, or they can be passed on to Casey. And this is where context is important, because Casey can say, this technique is being used. Thank you for identifying this. Now let's work on building out a test case and a detection for it. Or Casey can also say, this is way beyond anything that we need right now, or that is being leveraged by threat groups targeting our area. Let's put this on the backlog. And so having that dialogue and that conversation between teams is going to be super important. And although we've already touched on Casey's new role, the focus I want to point to here is that the research is going to be focused within the unicorn industry. And so while Casey was reading every vendor's CTI report before, and that's really great for knowing the entirety of landscape of threat actors, as far as making sure that Casey is providing the value necessary to both Alex and Brooke, it's going to require a bit more focused research. And so that's really what this role is changing to. And you'll see the two other bullet points also sort of highlight that. So the shifting roles that we've seen here between Alex, Brooke, and Casey are on how do we make sure that we know how to address these things as a team. And as you're doing this, you're going to be able to, again, chart your understanding. And so you have a joint goal between all of that blended expertise of red teaming, blue teaming, and cyber threat intelligence as you're able to weave through the model. And so the story here goes is that, while the team started with a little bit of a lopside of threat understanding, they charted out a path, they had a lot of momentum. And so it took them to the middle. They were able to level out their detection understanding with their threat understanding at integration. And then from there, they created a couple of novel detections, realized that they didn't quite have the research needed and threat understanding to test those. And so that's how they kept working their way to creating their own novel threats and detections for those. And they ended up with a very strong purple team. And so that's sort of the story of the purple maturity model, is that it's taking the expertise we already have. Because expertise is something, if you look at the top people that are in each of these fields, red teams, blue teams, cyber threat intel, we have a huge amount of expertise. I mean, these people are wizards, right? And geniuses when it comes to building these things out, building out detections, building out bypasses to it. And some of the tools that have come out have just been amazing. But how do we take all of that and bring it together? And purple teaming, I think, is that vehicle. It's sort of, and that's where we are trying to showcase how that can be used to move everyone forward in the industry. And so with that, we have answered our three main questions. Why does purple need a maturity model? What is that maturity model? And then how can we use it? And so with that, any questions? And thank you all for attending. Hand it back to you, George.
Yeah, thank you, Red Team Village. Thank you, Red Team Village organizers, and of course, all the attendees and sponsors and all that. Really appreciate the invite. And we will take questions on Discord. And hopefully you have some good feedback for us. Again, this is all what we're seeing out there. And hopefully we come back next year and let you know what else is happening. And of course, call to action for you to contribute as well. How are you implementing purple teaming in your organization? Are you doing purple team exercises? Do you have dedicated purple teamers, right? Keep sharing information because the malicious actors are doing it and we should too. So thank you again to the Red Team Village for all the contributions to the community. And thanks, Tim, for collaborating with me and allowing me to come speak a little bit on one of our favorite topics. So thank you again.